At this point, a discussion of the meta-timeline may help clarify some concepts. At this stage, many may be wondering about multiple time travel events. Using our previous example, if a timepiece team went back in time to fortify a facility, couldn't an Anarakian team go further back in time and prevent that fortification? The answer depends on the order of operations on the meta-timeline. As previously mentioned, all presents on the various timelines are synced to the true present or absolute present on iterant point. Iterant point is a physical location on the meta-timeline. It is not an entire Earth, but rather an artificial construct. Its true origins are as shrouded in mystery as those of the time gates. However, it is clearly a control facility for the time gate network. Some have mistakenly described iterant point as existing outside of time. This is not true. Iterant point has a definitive flow of time, like all standard timelines. However, iterant point and the meta-timeline exist independently from all other timelines. In short, time does pass on iterant point. It passes at the exact same rate as it does on all other timelines. From the control centers on iterant point, Timepiece can monitor activity across all of the other timelines. Iterant point contains the largest concentration of time gates across any timeline, as most of those are connected to gates on the various timelines. Anarakia has a similar facility in the meta-timeline, which also serves as their control center. Please note that because time passes on iterant point, there is an order in which agents are dispatched into the past. Let's use our previous example. On day 1 on iterant point, Timepiece sends agents back in time on a timeline. These agents fortify the defenses of a given facility. On day 2 on iterant point, and on the present of the other timeline, Anarakia notices the enhanced security. They send their own agents back in time on the timeline. However, because Timepiece agents acted on day 1 of the meta-timeline, their changes have already been implemented. They have priority in the time gate network. Therefore, if the Anarakian agents tried to make alterations on the timeline, these changes cannot contradict with what the Timepiece agents saw on their trip to the past. Remember, this does not mean that the Anarakians' changes cannot happen. It does mean that they are unlikely to be implemented by the network, however. In this case, the Timepiece agents have already had extensive observation of the facility's security measures. It would be extremely difficult to recontextualize all of the information the entire team had seen. In such a scenario, the Timegate network would more likely implement changes to the timeline which prevent the Anarakians from interfering in the first place. For example, the Anarakians might be improbably spotted and prevented from intervening. Remember, the Timegate networks balance probability and consistency when deciding which changes to make. This order of operations also applies to creating timeless or to a clipping event by an enigma. For example, let's say that on day 1, John was recruited to be a Timepiece agent. He would then be removed from his native timeline. On day 2, Anarakia sends agents back in his native timeline to assassinate him. They will be unsuccessful, however, because he will have never been on that timeline. This is because the timeline was altered by the network on day 1 of the meta-timeline. Similarly, if on day 1 of the meta-timeline an enigma clips John, he cannot be recruited on day 2. Even if on day 2 of the meta-timeline, Timeless went to the past of the timeline to recruit John, they would find that he never existed. Again, the changes to the timeline happened on day 1 of the meta-timeline. The operation, remove John from the timeline, happened prior to the operation, send the Timeless to this timeline's past. This is the origin of the meta-timeline's name. It is a timeline of the events which alter the timelines, a timeline of timelines. Having learned this, many agents ask the question, can we travel back in time on the meta-timeline? The answer for most of us is no. However, there are specialized timelists called white rabbits whose job it is to do precisely that. However, we should first note that traveling back in meta-time is a substantially different experience than traveling to the past of a timeline. It requires the creation of a rabbit hole. A rabbit hole is a special type of time-gate connection which is used to rewind meta-time. It comes with two definitive drawbacks, however. First, a rabbit hole can only be used by a full gate. Let us take a moment to note the differences between a minor time gate and a full time gate. A full time gate is one that is embedded within a wall or surface, often one belonging to a time gate facility. Few such facilities exist outside of Iterant Point, where the vast majority of full time gates are located. Full time gates are also the only time gates capable of creating future projections or traveling to a timeline's past. Minor time gates are far more common, though have much less functionality. Minor time gates consist only of the two intersecting rings and are often freestanding. Frequently, one ring is stationary and embedded into the ground, while the second ring rotates freely. This is in contrast to a full time gate. On those, both rings are embedded in a wall and spin freely. Minor time gates may connect to any other time gate, but may only do so between their present positions. The second drawback of creating a rabbit hole is their blackout effect. The endpoint of a rabbit hole is subject to a blackout, a cessation of time gate functionality. The time gate in the meta past, which is chosen as the exit point, ceases to function for a week in either temporal direction. In other words, for a week before and a week after the white rabbit arrives in the meta past. Additionally, many time gates across the network cease operation for a 24 to 48 hour period. This greatly reduces the number of safe choices for rabbit hole endpoints. As a reminder, the mission of most white rabbits is to bring useful information back in metatime to timepiece, with the goal of preventing a total defeat. However, creating these blackout events could radically alter the future of the destination metatimeline, rendering the given information useless. The nature of the metatimeline is also very distinct from most timelines, which affects traveling on it. It is often more useful to think of traveling back in metatime as rewinding the metatimeline, rather than traveling along it. Once a white rabbit enters a rabbit hole, they may not return to their previous metatimeline. Instead, the absolute present of Iterant Point is reset to the time of their arrival. This has sparked much debate in the Upsilon division. Since the previous metatimeline appears to have been erased, where does the white rabbit come from? Why do they continue to exist? Why does this not cause a paradox? There are no clear answers at this time, but the leading hypothesis is that the previous metatimeline is not erased, but merely converted into information. This would be a similar effect to the altering probabilities involved in creating a timeless. In that sense, a white rabbit may be something akin to a meta-timeless. However, many Upsilons are not convinced of this explanation. For your purposes, it is enough to say that the former meta-timeline no longer exists, save as a memory within the white rabbit. White rabbits also cannot be drawn from any timeless. They must pass a rigorous psychological examination and be compatible with a chemical treatment which allows them to survive the harsh conditions of a rabbit hole. White rabbits must remain on various medications for the rest of their lives due to this chemical treatment, which also bleaches their hair white. This, along with the nickname rabbit hole, is the origin of the term white rabbit. Because the absolute present has been reset, any number of changes may be made to the meta-timeline by a white rabbit. The limitations of an insertion into the past on a normal timeline do not apply. Instead, there are only considerations to be made about logistics. When and where can a blackout be afforded? How much information should be acted on immediately? Or how many of our actions from the previous meta-timeline should we repeat? While the usage of rabbit holes can prevent absolute defeat, they do come with a host of complications.